Recently on my Patreon site I posted a short video featuring a fellow painter, Dominic Butler, who makes his own paints. The article was very popular with everyone on my site and fascinated with the process and what Dom was able to achieve with his really loose watercolors. Well, I was fascinated as well, and Dom very kindly sent me a sample of his paints to give him a little bit of a test drive. So this is a video of me, Tim Wilmot, painting entirely with Dom's homemade paints. And this is the scene I chose. This is Watermouth Bay, or it might be called actually Watermouth Harbour in North Devon. Pretty dull day, but I'm going to invent a few shadows here. Quite a simple scene with the lifeboat there being centre stage. Nice backdrop of some hills there in the background. A few little boats and craft leading down to the sea. And then we have a little sort of river, little stream here in the foreground with some nice reflections, and then the harbour bed just littered with seaweed and little pebbles and stones and things, and then running across, quite a nice pattern, running mainly horizontally. We've got all these sort of chains and rigging that are tethering the boats down. So that's the scene. Homemade watercolour paints in my style, and let's see how we get on. For this test drive, I'm using Saunders Waterford cold press paper, medium roughness. And here we have the homemade paints, Dom's homemade paints on the right hand side in its own little palette. And I've got 4 colours here, only 4 colours. So it's yellow ochre at the top, then there's a cadmium red, then a cerulean blue, and a dark ultramarine blue. So there's just those 4 colours. Well, I will be using a little bit of white towards the end. I'll explain that towards the end. So just 4 colours. And as I normally do, little outline sketch just to get in the main shapes. I quite like the shape of the hills in the background and trying to sort of mimic this little stream meandering down to the shoreline. So that's sort of going right to left. But first of all, I need to get in the focal point, which is the lifeboat. So it's a nice low tide scene. Quite easy, I think, to draw boats at low tide, and quite simple shapes when we're looking at them sideways on. So getting in the base of the hull of the lifeboat, it's got a slight, the actual base has got a slight slope down left to right. And I've got, I suppose the main difficulty with that lifeboat is getting in the little curve of the gunnel at the top of the hull. Now, even simpler are these more distant boats going down to, I'll just include a few. In my reference photo there were loads in there, so just include a few just to sort of fill up the space on the left hand side and lead the eye down over to the left, and pointing, they're sort of all pointing towards the sea. Quite simple shapes. Maybe another one on the right hand side. I've got a bit of a gap there on the right hand side, so pop in some small little rowing boat or similar on the right hand side. And then the far side of the shoreline, it's sort of just a little bit below the tops of the boats. Now, the top of the hill, very simply drawn in there. I need to think about the shape of the trees. This is an exposed part of the coast, and there's, I'm sure in the winter, lots of gales come in from the Atlantic, and the trees are sort of all pointing, they're sort of bent over and they're pointing one way, away from the main direction of the wind. So I'll try and, when I paint in the top hills there, try and get the brush marks to give the impression of these trees growing that kind of direction. I'm using a 3B pencil, so quite dark, soft pencil, and I'm sneaking in a little figure into the scene. Just think it needs it there, and it just gives me another object to create a reflection in that little stream. So that stream in the foreground, again, a bit like the hills, very quickly drawn in, and I'll sort of follow the lines when I paint in the harbour bed. I'll sort of follow those lines, just a bit more detailed to the boat, just to make sure I'm happy with that. It is a sort of key part of the painting, so it does need to be absolutely right, or as good as I can get it before I start painting. And that's the reflection of the lifeboat. Perhaps just a slither of a few reflections from the distant boats, but not too many. And so down to some painting. As I said, this all started from a little article I had up on Patreon featuring Dom's homemade paints, and he went through the actual process of making these paints with of course, the pigment, the very important pigment, and the binder, and then the third element is a little bit of raw honey. So it sounds like quite a simple process, but it does take a bit of skill to put those elements together. So the colours, just to repeat, are yellow ochre at the top, then I've got a cadmium red, then a cerulean blue, and a dark ultramarine blue. Now I did need to just pre-wet the paints a little bit, since shipping to me they're a little bit dry, so there's no problem with that. They just need to be dampened a little bit just to liven them up and make it easier to work with. So I just place a little bit of water in each of those little wells, and, well, starting with the sky, as I normally do. So quite a simple sky. It's a very small part of the overall picture, but it's in the actual source photo, it's a sort of dull, overcast day, and I'll keep to that theme. So coming down over the hills now, trying to get a little bit greener with the base colour of the hills. So I'm just really covering up the main parts of the paper here. I'm not really, this isn't going to be the eventual colour of the hills. I'm just covering up all of the paper except these white boats. So coming down to the tops of the boats, then I just need to be a little bit careful with the painting around the boats. Go a bit cooler now, so I'm mixing in that cerulean blue, a little bit cooler towards the base of the background hills. I'm using a mop brush, well, most of this painting will be done with mop brushes. And this is a squirrel mop brush, so it's very soft and it's got a good edge and a good point to it, so I can be quite precise now painting around those white boats. I'll paint over the figure. The figure's going to be dark on a lighter background, so I can paint over that one. Around the bottom of the hull. Down on the right hand side. So first chance to use a bit of this cadmium red, of course on the top of the lifeboat. Now the actual lifeboat in the picture was a sort of orangey red. With the colours I've got here, that might be quite difficult to replicate with the yellow ochre and the cadmium red, so I'm just getting as close as I can to it with the limited palette here. And it doesn't matter that this red colour goes all over the place. A lot of the actual boat is red, the lifeboat is red as well, so it doesn't matter if that's just going over the edges there. Now there's a slight slope on the board, so it just makes it easier to start at the top, work my way down, and then there's a little bit of a bead forming as I'm coming down, which you can see it there just coming on down. And the first thing I'm noticing with these handmade paints is that there's a nice bit of granulation. If you like granulation in your watercolors, then there's a bucket full of granulation in these colors. They're really good. Now, down in the foreground, I'm going to make this stream quite light, so that won't be painted over again, but I'm going to go darker for the harbour bed, the ground, if you like, beyond the stream and this side of the stream. I'm actually going to make I'm thinking about making the foreground quite sort of warm in colour, a bit of a sort of reddish, purplish colour if I can. So put on a bit of that cadmium red on top of the blue. Cover up the whole of that left-hand corner down to the bottom. So this is just the base colour here at this stage. I won't be doing the sky again, I won't be doing the stream again. I think that the top of that lifeboat needs to be a little bit deeper in red. The thing with any watercolour paints, they're going to dry a lot lighter than you think, and so you've got to compensate for that. So that's why I've gone in again with a second application of that cadmium red. So I'm now letting this first wash dry completely before I go on to the next stage, which will be the background hills. And I will speed up the process. I've got a hairdryer handy. Speed things up a little bit, and you will notice it will dry a little bit lighter. You can actually see the granulation on the palette as well. I've got a fairly cheap white plastic palette that I just had knocking around, and gave it a good clean, and then put Dom's paints on those, just so I got a fresh start. I'm using a slightly smaller mop brush now. This is a Jackson's Squirrel Mop size 10. So it's about, well, it's almost 10 millimeters in diameter. Darker in value, a bit of yellow ochre, dark ultramarine blue, and as I do mix it, I'm constantly checking my brush just to check it's got the right kind of moisture in it. I don't want it to be too dry, don't want it to be too wet. If it's too wet, as soon as I touch the paper, all the paint comes out and I might end up with a terrible mess. So just keep checking my brush head, that I've got a good edge to it. And then as I'm going from left to right, I want to try and, at the top of the hill, give a sort of indication to these trees that are growing from left to right because of most of the wind in this part of the world. Most of the wind is coming in from the west, and it's all the trees on the coast. They can't grow into the wind. They're sort of growing away from the wind. So you have this wonderful lean to them, which I think is quite attractive, and it from a sort of compositional point of view, it's quite nice to feature that on the ridge of that hill. Now, the other good thing about these paints, as I can see right now, is, well, this granulation, nice. I can actually work with them for quite a long time. They don't dry too quickly. Not sure whether that's down to the paints themselves or maybe the humidity of the room I'm in right now, but it's a nice. You can work with them quite well, and got a fair bit of time to play around with the colours before they dry. So yellow ochre, ultramarine blue, dark. Try and go a little bit greener for these background hills. There's sort of a patchwork of little tiny fields on the background hills, but if I put too much detail in those background hills, all the trees and the hedgerows, it would just be, that would be, your eyes would draw towards that. I want the focal point to be the sort of row of boats going across the middle and featuring the lifeboat. Keep it quite cool as well. So I've painted around again the white boats on the left, and now a little bit of careful painting around. This is where I need a good edge on my brush, whatever brush I'm using. And on this lifeboat, there's a sort of front structure to the lifeboat, and then there's the cabin, the main cabin at the back. So the back of the boat is to the right, and then down this cabin. It doesn't matter if I leave out little bits of paper as I'm drawing in the background hills, doesn't matter at all. Keep mixing. Yellow ochre, ultramarine blue, and then down the end of the boat on top of this little boat that I've inserted on the right. I can use the fingers if I need to. You can see still there's quite a lot of shine, so it's keeping wet for quite some time. I could, for example, I could do a bit of splattering. Well, not now. It would need to go. It's just drying to a sort of damp stage. For this is the background hills are at a sort of moist stage, I would call it now. But when that shine just begins to disappear, that would be a good time to do some splattering. And these handmade paints, they would be quite good. They would be quite receptive to a little bit of splattering. Now, on the left-hand side, so the sea is down to the left, and there's a little tiny shallow triangle there on the left-hand side where the sea might be just coming in. So I'm now going over with this slightly lighter colour compared to the hills. Paint around the bottom bits of the boats and then coming down to the edge of the stream, the far side of the stream. Sneak in a little bit of yellow ochre. What I also want to feature on this painting is this lovely seaweed that's going over the harbour bed. Unfortunately, I can't. It's actually quite a bright sort of yellowy green in the photograph, but I'll do my best with the yellow ochre. Continue over the right-hand side. What I also notice with the handmade paints is that there's not too much bleeding going on. So if you don't want, as I was going up to the base of the hills there, there was not much merging or bleeding of one paint into the other. So you've got good control. So Dom, whatever the mixture was there, that worked really well. Just continue on down the right-hand side, just whip in a few little darker bits. I don't want to mess around with the harbour bed too much. I'm still experimenting with these paints, so I don't know how they're going to handle with that sort of, when it's a kind of weak wash there. I'm not sure how they're going to handle. I don't want them to look a little bit overworked, is what I'm trying to say. Now, bottom left-hand corner, go a bit warmer. Follow the rough line I drew in, that sort of random edge to the stream, which sort of mirrors it sort of mirrors the shape of the hill in the background. Again, it doesn't matter if I leave out little bits here and there. I'll actually try and do my best in covering the whole of this bottom left corner. Maybe a little bit too red, but it doesn't matter. I might try just a tiny bit of splattering. Just a little bit. You can just see the paint is still moving around, and if I didn't speed things up with a hairdryer and with a good slope, I get some interesting shapes and little blooms creating, I'm sure. So I've got to let that dry again before I then start to do so the plan here is to do the boats on the left, working from left to right because I'm right-handed, and this is where I'm adding in the darker values. So I'm creating more depth to the painting and more form, so trying to create some extra dimensions to the painting. And I will speed up things again with the hairdryer that I'll get out shortly, and I'll fast forward to the next step. So painting nice and dry. Just check it with my fingertips. Now, the next brush I've also got here, I'm using a brush that's an Skoda Versatile, but I've actually hacked around with the head of it a little bit. I've got a pair of scissors out and just sort of cut away some of the hairs, so it's actually a sort of smaller head to it. But just right, just the right sort of size brush, I think, for doing these holes. So a sort of bluish, a light bluish greyish colour for these holes, and I need to keep them fairly moist, and then going with a darker colour underneath the boats for the shadow and the darker bit of the hole. So that's the furthest boat. Then I've got a boat just a little bit in front of that. Now a smaller detail brush here, which is, this is a brush from Rosemary and Company in the UK. This is a michaelkleinpaintings.com brush, but it's got a really nice point to it. I'll be using this quite a lot for doing rigging and the highlighting with this brush. So I find it sometimes handy to have one brush for applying the shady part of an object, a car or a boat, and then have a second brush ready that I'm going to use for darker, thicker paint for creating shadows that go across the ground or go into the object. So the sun's coming from the right in this scene. Maybe it's a sort of early morning scene, maybe, I think, the sun, with the sun direction I've got. So I was working with this overcast photographs. I had to kind of invent the directions of the shadows. In with a figure, very simply painted. Nothing too complicated. again with this, the smallest brush I'm using, and then get in a bit of a shadow, a few lines across the harbour bed. Could be bits of ropes and chains that are going across the scene. Few little details to the tops of the boats, the gunwales. Now over to the lifeboats. I need to mix a darker red. So that ultramarine blue, the dark ultramarine blue, and the cadmium red. So again, thinking of the sun coming from the right hand side, and the actual top of this lifeboat is quite complicated, so I'm just really simplifying it into those two main elements on the top of the boat. The front bit, maybe it sort of contains lots of rescue gear, and then the actual main cabin here at the rear of the boat. And then from the bow, going from the bow to the stern, there's this quite distinctive white line that I'll see what it looks like just leaving the paper unpainted. I might need to use a bit of white paint to emphasize this line if it's not good enough. So this is below the white line here. Darker in colour, coming down into the proper part of the hull. So try and be careful with my painting around that line. And then painting in the rest of the hull. Just really this darker mix. Really the darkest I can achieve with this limited 4-colour palette is using that dark ultramarine blue and the cadmium red. The combination of those, probably mainly dark ultramarine blue and a little bit of red, is going to give me something close to a sort of neutral tint or a Payne's grey. So with a good edge on this brush, I should be able to get a little bit of a bumpy outline to the edge of the shadows, just to sort of give the impression of the rough surface of the harbour bed. So I don't want it to be too straight, just a little bit of few little bumps and kinks in it. There we go. Over to the right hand side, just touch up a little bit of the hull, just so that it's not too monotonous in colour. I forgot this boat on the right hand side. Let's do that one now. So with my Escoda versatile brush, and then pick up the smaller brush for the dark shadow. Just connect up a few of those shapes with the with a few little lines there for the far side of the bay. A few more coming towards us. Could be little bits of shingle or ropes or whatever. What I'm doing now is I'm going to try and mix up as green a colour as I can get with yellow ochre to do the seaweed on the harbour bed. So I've just got to scrape off a little bit of that blue. It's contaminated with a bit of blue that crept in earlier. So just get that top layer off. My plan here is that I will, in a fairly sort of random way, just dab in a little bit of this green colour, or as close to green as I can get it, and then with a smaller brush, just give it a little bit of a shadow on the left-hand side, or the side facing us, just so that we can give the impression of some sort of thickness to the layer of seaweed, rather than it being a very thin layer, a bit more of a volume to the seaweed. So I'm trying to make it a little bit greener, but not being too successful with this limited palette. So I'll just crack on. It's mainly yellow ochre, to be honest with you. And starting on the left-hand side, fairly moist mix, because I do want, when I go in with the dark shadows, I want there to be a bit of a soft edge, so it's not too dry, this paint, not too much water on the brush. And in this fairly random fashion, go up to the edge, fairly random fashion in this sort of left-hand little triangle. Put in this seaweed. Not too much. I don't want to overwork it too much if I can help it. Perhaps from the right hand side there's a little bit of seaweed coming down, and that will connect in a little bit to, I'll have that connecting to the left hand seaweed. Bit of a dry brush mark here for the distant seaweed, just to give it a faint sort of green layer to it. Now, with my smaller brush, just now create a little bit of this sort of thickness or volume to the seaweed with a bit of shadow underneath it, or to the side of it. So ultramarine blue, dark ultramarine blue. Just a little dab here and there, thinking about the direction of the sun and those shadows. Not too much, just here and there. And as the yellow ochre, that green bit is still quite damp, I'm getting a little bit of a soft edge. I need to work quite quickly because some of the thinner layers that I applied, they're drying quite quickly. So with the thicker bits, they're still quite moist, but I need to work quite quickly across this area. And hopefully that's sort of giving the impression of a bit of thickness to that seaweed layer. A bit more on the far side. A few little dots here and there. Could be little tiny stones or shingle. Tiny bit to create a form for the far side, and then that little lighter area there, I just put a bit of shadow on the left hand side, so instantly I'm creating a little tiny, well, little boulder, or a big stone, a little boulder. You can spot these little marks the watercolor makes, and then you can make something of them, a lighter area, put a bit of shadow behind it, and we've got an instant stone or boulder. Right, so I'm thinking here, I'll have this horizontal line of seaweed sort of cutting the reflection of the lifeboat that I'm going to put in towards the end, or a little bit later, kind of cutting that. So I've got the darker part of the reflection, and a little bit of a light for the little bits of seaweed. Clear these brushes away. This isn't my normal palette, so I'm just getting used to where can I put my brushes when I'm not using them. I know some people might hold them in their left hand or have a proper brush holder. I'm just making do, keeping them there on the right hand side, hopefully not rolling into the painting. Now I'm just checking the edge of my brush now. I'm doing the reflections of the well, mainly this lifeboat. I need a little, I think I have a little bit of reflection for the other boats, but getting in the lifeboat reflection here. So these brush marks are sort of from left to right, and if I've got any little gaps, that could be just a little bit of a wave or a ripple in the water catching the sunlight. Again, check the edge, make sure I've got a good edge. Over to this second piece of seaweed. Just check that it's actually quite a simple reflection. A very sort of rough rectangle in a way. I think that looks all right. Reflection of the figure. to the shore. Too much, I might just try and lift off a little bit of paint with my fingertip. Tiny bit of reflections for those boats, not too much because they're further away. In fact, I could have got away with no reflections at all. That would have been quite nice. I'll put in the masts very shortly though. So, small brush. I'm running out of the red. No more red. Luckily, red was only a small part of this scene. Now, some bits of roping and rigging coming down from this boat and going across the surface of the harbour. Now, they're not continuous lines. They're very much lost and found. Little bits of gaps in them. Let's have three ropes or whatever coming off the lifeboat, the back of the boat, and I have a bit of a gap, a bit of a space between the boat and then its reflection. Is a little bit void at the moment, so I'm thinking about filling something in there. A few more little bits of shadow on the seaweed. So this is the bigger brush now. I use this versatile brush just to create a few dry brush marks, maybe smaller bits of shingle, or perhaps a vehicle has just driven down there, created a few tire marks. There are a few little thin horizontal lines, maybe just little tiny waves or little ripples on the water surface. So back to my smallish brush now and getting a few strong verticals, the masts and navigation stuff on the lifeboat. Got some quite distinctive masts on the lifeboat. There's so much detail on that lifeboat, I can't do it justice with in this loose watercolour, so I'm just putting in a few marks here and there to indicate maybe a little window or a porthole, something on the side of the boat. few little windows and doorways on that yacht. Then with that cerulean blue, I think that would make quite a nice folded up sail on that far yacht. I need to now get in the mast, so with this small brush I'm going to use some white paint in a minute, which is not handmade. I have cheated a little bit here, so everything so far I've been using Dom's handmade paint, so just a little bit of dark for the tips of the masts that are against the sky. And then I need to remember their reflections. Try and get them to line up as best I can. Bit more of a detail on the boat, some railings or something. That's the bow. Something dark in the middle, not sure what it is. And there are these chains that are strewn across the harbour bed, so I'll just put in or give the impression of one of those. So the next step now is to get in a little bit of white paint to create some highlights. So this is not handmade paint. This is white gouache. All right. So well, it could be any white, and just in a few little places, just pick up a little bit of a sparkle where the light's catching it. So the tops of the boat there, perhaps some railings. Do need to go over that white line, leaving it sort of light red. It doesn't not too bright, so it's dulled down a little bit with the red behind it, so it comes up hopefully the right value. And there is a very faint thinner line below that. Top bits of the ropes catching the light. Dip my brush in the tube again, perhaps catching the tops of that chain, top of the figurehead, the lower part of the masts. Try and keep them in line. A few little side supports to the masts, a boom. Some railings on the side of the lifeboat. Some little objects on the right hand side. Back of the boat. And that's it done. So there we are, a test drive of some handmade paints by fellow painter Dom. If you join my Patreon scheme, you'll be able to see Dom's or me interviewing Dom and ask him lots of deep and searching questions about the why and the what and the how of how he goes about making his own watercolor paints. But I'm quite pleased with the end result. Very different, or quite different from the effect I get with my normal watercolor paints, which I use a combination of Daniel Smith and Winsor Newton. But if you listen to the video of Dom and I, you'll see why, or the sorts of effects you can get. But I sort of zoom into this. So this was Watermouth Harbour, North Devon, UK. A dull day, but I brightened it up a little bit. And so what I found with the handmade paints was lovely granulation. I just zoom into this. Lovely granulation there, do you see? Fantastic. Quite smooth on the red. So the cadmium red didn't granulate, but I guess this is a little bit of the ultramarine blue doing this. So lovely granulation. It takes a lot of wear and tear. The actual paint is quite robust. You can lift out quite easily. It stays wet for quite a long length of time as well. I also found down in this area here, when I was applying the paint, so I was applying the paint with, if I can see if I can draw this in. So I was coming down this direction with the thicker paint, and then I was making the transition into the lighter area, but the two didn't bleed together, so that was quite nice in that area. And tiny bit of sort of splattering I've got in the background hills as well. Probably if I'd have waited for it to dry a little bit longer, that would have been a bit more evident, but quite happy with the background hills. Fairly basic and very simple. Didn't want to draw in individual trees and hedgerows and so on. Perhaps I was a bit thick on some of the paint underneath the boat. So I wanted that to, I zoom in here. So ideally, what I was doing was I applied a light wash on the side of the boat, and then I went in with the darker colour there, and I wanted there to be, ideally I would have wanted a softer edge there, but it's all right, it's okay. yeah, so very happy with the results. I think with anything, when you start using different paints, or you make the switch from sort of shop bought paints, manufactured paints to homemade paints, I guess it would take quite a few paintings to get used to the consistency of the paint and the mixing qualities and the drying time and how much can you work them. So it's going to take a little bit of time, but quite pleased with the results, and a massive thank you to Dominic Butler. Dom, thanks very much for providing a little sample of these magical paints that you make there. Hope you enjoyed the result. Check out the Patreon site if you want to get involved on our monthly projects and our online chats and get-togethers, and videos up there that you won't see on YouTube. But thanks for watching. Catch up with you next time.